Hello, and welcome to Sobercast, where we provide AA speaker meetings and workshops in podcast format. We're an ad-free podcast, and if you enjoy listening, please help us be self-supporting by visiting Sobercast.com, look for the donate link, and drop $1 or $2 into our virtual basket. We hope you enjoyed the podcast. Have a great day.
I am an alcoholic. My home group is Living Our Traditions, and we meet Friday nights in a little town called Rainham, Massachusetts. My name is Anne Marie. And I would like to thank Josephine and her committee for inviting me to come down and spend some time with you. It could not have come in a better time, but then God knows that far better than I. And I need to say this, it's really important. God's been very good to me over the years. I've had an opportunity to travel. I've had an opportunity to meet a tremendous amount of men and women in Alcoholics Anonymous. But by far, Josephine is a woman who walks humbly with God. What a terrific example. You are so blessed to have her here. Now, in case you think I'm looking at you, I guess there's a piece about me you need to know. I have a visual impairment. I can't see you. So I'm really not directing it at you. Now, of course, if the shoe fits, do with it as you wish. I'd also like to thank some of the people. If they are examples of the power and the spirit of Alcoholics Anonymous in the greater Michigan area, then more power to you. And I'd like to thank Kathy W. and Cindy and Deb and Sheila and certainly Beverly and some others that I met. And you embraced me from the minute I walked in the door and made me feel at home. And isn't that an important piece? Because I don't know about you, but for most of my life, before God grace guided me to Alcoholics Anonymous, I was never a part of, I was always apart from. And I wondered what was wrong with me. And I didn't know. You've all met Dolores from Cleveland. Last night, Dolores said, "Oh, and what are you going to talk about?" And nothing moved. My mouth didn't move. My face didn't move. My mouth opened and closed again, and I went, "You'll find out when I do." But now I know what I'm going to talk about. So for Dolores, I'm going to talk about the sun, the snow, and the river. And they so touch my whole life. And before I forget, the crew from Hawaii, if you happen to have any more of those Mauna Loa macadamia clusters and you don't know what to do with them, you can just send them this way. Made my day last night, and I went, I wonder how these are. And I popped it in the mouth, and I went, where are those women? So coming off the single worst professional year of my life, and I'm sure there's more than one person in this room who's had this experience. In the position I've worked in, I've been there for 6 years, and literally the worst 12 to 13 months I've ever experienced has challenged every fiber of working a program of recovery and continued spiritual development. And I wanted sometimes that spiritual development to be my bosses, and recognize that it had to be mine. My home group does a study, and it applies to what I'm about to share with you about my experience recently. And that is, we're a literature study group, and we started in 1989 when some people came to me and said, "Annie, it'd really be nice if we could sit down and talk about how we apply the traditions into our daily lives." And I said, "Sure, I'll be happy to do that." And while we were at it, do you think we could throw in some concepts and the steps and the big book? I said, "So let me get this straight. What you want is a 12-step, 12 tradition, 12 concept, big book, study group. Yep, that's it. Yeah, sure, I can do that. And that's what we've been doing. And as the years evolved and have gone by, I can tell you there is nothing static about this meeting. We laugh a lot. It is probably drop dead honest on a regular basis. I shouldn't say probably. We could spend weeks, if not months, on one particular aspect of those 36 spiritual principles. And we've come to lovingly call it the incredible tapestry. And that is what my life is all about today. So, of course, those of you who are reasonably familiar with the news know that New England really hasn't had much of a winter this year. It was particularly southern New England, which is where I'm from. I'm closer to Providence, Rhode Island, than I am to Boston, although I was born and bred in Boston. I found that out. I kind of, had nothing to do when I first showed up here on Thursday, so I sort of saw everybody stuffing things, and I said, "Do you need some help?" And they said, "Yes." And so I'm stuffing them, and there are two women out here, and one's last name begins L-A-R. That's hard for me to say, you understand. And the other is L-A-W, which sounded like the same to me. And wouldn't you know, they both have the same first name? Until one came back and said to me, and she pronounced her name. And I said, "Well, that's what I said, wasn't it?" And that's the broad A. But, of course, just before we came in here into Denver, we had the storm that you guys had all been in Detroit. Did I say Denver? What can I tell you? A little of that old Rocky Mountain High, just still, I used to run away to Denver, and I used to run away to Colorado, and I had to go back in sobriety to make sure it was really as beautiful and spectacular as I thought it was. It is. So we had the storm, and, God's amazing grace. Got to the airport, not a problem. In Rhode Island, it was turning to rain anyway. Very gray, very dark. And you could sort of feel a little restless, irritable discontent running around the airport as you watch one flight after another getting canceled down, particularly in and out from Providence to Chicago. But Providence to Detroit was still up there as coming in, and that plane came in 10 minutes late, and 20 minutes later we took off. And I thought, is that safe? 20 minutes to turn it around? And they were all happy and cheerful and saying, "Hey, welcome aboard." And I thought, that's jet lag if I've ever seen it. Within maybe 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5, I'm sure there's some airline people here, we went from the slush and the ice and the rain and broke through those clouds into bright sunshine with that sun setting in the west. You know that place when for those of you who really enjoy flying, when you get way up above those white clouds, and it's as quiet as can be out there. And there was the sun setting in the west. In 1958, in response to a letter to a friend, Bill Wilson wrote that he had finally found his quiet place in the bright sunshine. That's encapsulated in his essay, Emotional Sobriety. And when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous and I saw emotional balance and emotional sobriety in our literature, I wanted to know how to get there. That's what I wanted more than anything else. And so when we lifted up above those clouds, the last 13 or 14 months literally stayed back. And I could feel that freedom. The freedom of not dragging the baggage of yesterday with me into this day. And so I said, the sun, the snow, and the river. I spent about 2 hours this afternoon. I could listen to people in the elevators. I was just kind of wandering around aimlessly and listening to people muttering and mumbling about snow, and it's cold, and it's cold, and it's snow, and I said, it's Michigan. Even I know that. This is not the Bahamas. And so I'm listening to all of that, and I went upstairs, and I opened up the drapes, and I just pulled up the chair, and I sat there, just staring out at the river. And then I noticed the snow was going up. And I thought I hadn't had that much caffeine today. And then I saw it swirling a bit, you know? And then I figured it out. Oh, there's an updraft here. Yay, physics, Anne Marie, aerodynamics. And then it would just sort of almost stop. And I thought, that's my life. In a nutshell, the incredible tapestry of Alcoholics Anonymous in my life. The freedom that I find in turning my will and my life over to a power far greater than myself. I kicked and screamed about step 3 because of the word God. Let me tell you about a very early experience with God. I grew up in Boston, went to public schools. No aspersions on anyone in the clergy today. But where I grew up in Dorchester, neighborhood of Boston, if you went to a public school and then you had to go to CCD classes, you were a second-class citizen, according to some of the nuns. And that's just the way it was. And so there I am at the wonderful age of 9, and I was thinking about this, watching the snow come and swirl down and then go up. The up part still bothered me a bit. And so we're in this big hall, auditorium, and this huge picture on the back of God. And it should have been a flag waving in my head that you're destined for trouble, child. We are children of chaos. Yes. If nobody has ever seen God, how do we know He looks like that? Wrong move. And so I was marched outside and into a classroom, and I was told to put out my hand. And 2 broken knuckles later, at that time we didn't know about things like child abuse, the ACLU, or a few other things. And when I went home and showed my mother my hand, she asked me what I did to provoke the nuns. And that left a stamp on me, as you might imagine. And 2 years later, when I went to my mother to tell her that I had been assaulted by my brother, she asked me what I had done to provoke him. And that would set the course for the next several years of my life. And like the snowflakes that were swirling up and pausing peacefully, and like that quiet place above those clouds where it felt just so safe and so bright, that quiet place in the sunshine. It would take a long time. I didn't drink as a kid. Actually, I was kind of like that little girl in Harry Potter. Up the hand would go before the question was finished. I was the A+ student, the one you hated. I was always captain of the team, always did my homework. Extra credit. You really wanted to hurt me. I was, by the way, so self-absorbed and self-centered I didn't even notice. But I began a life of overachievement. Because whatever I did wrong, I'll fix it. It must be my fault. I'm not good enough. I had not yet had a drink of alcohol. I was not raised in a household where alcohol was ever shown. Never saw it, never heard about it, and yet intuitively I knew there was something evil and wrong and awful about alcohol. It would take me years into my spiritual path before I ever uncovered how that happened. And what had turned out is, at a very, very young age, I had overheard a horrible conversation between my parents and an uncle and a doctor, and apparently my father was near death's door. He was wrapped up in blankets in the kitchen by the stove because at the time that was the only heat in the house. And it had to do with alcohol. And what it was is he was in withdrawal. My dad did become a self-admitted alcoholic who just didn't drink. He was brought to the very first meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous in the greater Boston area, had a first edition, first printing copy of the big book that my mother almost threw away. Please. I spent 10 years on the archives committee. I said, "You did what?" Fortunately, it's safely in the hands of my sister-in-law, who's also in recovery. Challenged her sobriety at one point, too. Did I? But my first drink didn't happen then. I was 20 years old before I had my first drink, and by the time I was 20, I already had a daughter who was a year and a half. I was a homeowner, and, I got married. Well, that's what good Catholic girls did then, you know. You get pregnant, you get married. If I knew then what I know now. Had not had a drink of alcohol, didn't understand. I knew something was wrong. My first drink of alcohol was not social, and I wasn't in a group. I wasn't in a party, and it wasn't really a drink. My former husband, came home one night, and when I regained consciousness, pretty much everything in the room was broken, including me. And I happened to be working in the medical profession at the time, and I knew that alcohol had once upon a time been used as an anesthetic, so I went over to the bar, which miraculously hadn't been broken. I always think about that and say, well, what was that all about? And I drank a bottle. And so I learned 2 things that night. 3. The first thought that came to my head was not call the police for assault and battery. It was not call mother for help. My first thought was, whatever I did wrong, I'll fix it. And I would spend the next 15 to 16 years trying to fix it. And the only thing that happened in my alcoholism from that point to the end of my drinking was it got worse. It got considerably worse. And then I also experienced the next morning, I witnessed an alcoholic blackout. Because when he came around the corner and looked at the living room and at me, he threw up. He didn't remember anything. And it was not a put on. It was an alcoholic blackout. No doubt about it. I didn't know that then, and I know that now. In the course of my drinking, I went from being the A-plus student, graduated in the top percentage of her class, being voted the most likely to succeed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to finding myself standing one day saying and believing what I had been told for years, that I was stupid, incompetent, unnecessary, unlovable, and that everybody, including my 2 children, would be much better off if I would just go away and die. And so I went away. And God's amazing grace touched my life. I didn't get sober right away, but I did detox on my own. Don't ever do that. And eventually, as you know, an accident waiting to happen, I picked up a drink, and that drink took me finally to the point of absolute insanity, literally, where I walked into this emergency room of a hospital in central Massachusetts, and I thought it was really terrific that they had a greeting party for me. And they were all wearing white. And they were very big men. And I thought, well, isn't this wonderful? I wish someone had taken a picture of it. I really do. I can only imagine what I look like. And it was an acute care psychiatric unit, and from that unit I got the help I needed. I was the only one they wouldn't let go out for the July 4th weekend. Well, what's the problem? Well, you see, Annie, there's a thing. They'll all come back because they want their meds. You won't. And so I applaud these young women who are here because it's so young in sobriety, because I didn't even get out of lockup. You know, they didn't even let me, I didn't have the keys. That was the first. I didn't get out of there until I was just about stepping into my 4th month of getting sober. And from there they said, well, you know what, we think you should go to some transitional residence. I said, okay, that sounds cool. I said, where is it? And they told me it was in this city called Brockton, Massachusetts. Now, I don't know if any of you know anything about Brockton, Massachusetts. Let me tell you, where it's Halloween every day. And you live under a perpetual state of full moon. It's the 5th largest city in the state of Massachusetts, and I know we have someone here from Ireland, so she can correct me. I was told historically that Brock, B-R-O-C-K, is a Gaelic word for skunk. And I thought, that makes perfect sense. So here I come from a very country, gentrified atmosphere out in central Massachusetts, where I would roam the Sudbury Woods for 200 plus acres of woods back there, and I would find that quiet place in the bright sunshine in the middle of the woods. And I would stand there and believe that there was hope, that life was not meant to be like this. It was not meant, this isn't what I planned on when you grow up someday. I grew up as a little girl believing in heroes and dreams and happily ever afters. And at that point in my life, at the age of about 25, they had been shattered by those that society says I should be able to trust. But society says I should be able to experience love and acceptance from. I don't dance society's dance anymore. And AA gave me that freedom. The best thing that ever happened to me was that transitional residence. By the way, you all figured it out. It was a halfway house. So here she comes, strolling in the door from 14-room country estate, unlimited income, all the jangles and now what do you call it, bling, whatever you want to call it, came through the door, and this 6 foot in her barefoot Greek goddess is standing there, and she said, "And what do you want, Missy? To go home?" And she said, as I hear it, "You don't have one anymore." And I thought, what am I doing? Whose good idea was this? It was the best thing that ever happened to me. As much as I joke about the city of Brockton, I walked into the Brockton Sunday morning meeting to find some 225, 250 people in the room. It's held at Brockton High School, and among the front tables, front 2 to 3 rows, at that point it was 1983, and there were all of the people sitting in these tables had 20 to 25 to 37 years of sobriety. And I went right down and played with the big kids. One of whom, such a sweetheart, she was about 4'10", had white hair that never moved. Wore more diamonds than you could possibly see, cigarette in hand. She'd had a massive coronary, cigarette in hand. You could smoke then. And she took one look at me, and I was dressed to the nines. And she said, "Sweetheart, sit down. You are the sickest one in this room." Excuse me? And that wonderful woman took me page by page, chapter by chapter, sentence by sentence through the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And she took me through it again, and she took me through it again. And she took me through the 12 steps, and she reminded me there are 2 parts to that book. And she took me through the 12 steps and the 12 traditions, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, page by page, always stopping and say, "Do you understand how that applies to you?" At one of my very first 12-step meetings with this woman, she leaned over and she said, "It's okay, sunshine, don't worry about it. You really won't have anything to talk about tonight because we're going to be talking about character defects, and I'm sure you don't have any." You know, somehow I knew that was not a compliment. This woman was not my sponsor. She became my spiritual guide. And I'll tell you why. Because my first sponsor walked into that halfway house to do a presentation to the residents, and I hated her instantly. Because she walked in laughing. And she walked in with her head up high. And she walked in with her shoulders back. And you could tell she was thrilled to death to be alive. And she was comfortable with who she was. And I hated that. Because it had been so long since I'd ever felt that way. And she truly was military. She had a lifetime military background. And no joke, when Midge walked in the room, you didn't know whether to say hi, put your hand out, give her a hug, or stand at attention. You know, you just never knew. But again, with love. She was black belt with love. And she and Edwina were very different. And I never used Edwina as a sponsor because I recognized and I know it was the grace of God who brought me here. Edwina was the grandmother figure I'd never had. And she admitted that, as far as she was concerned, I could do no wrong. And that's a dangerous place to be. Because you don't need a sponsor who thinks you're cute. You know, oh, she's just like my granddaughter, isn't she cute? No. Do you know what this woman did? This woman, I was about 2.5 years sober, and Edwina's husband had to go into the hospital unexpectedly, and she couldn't sleep. So she said, "Annie, I want you to come over and spend the night with me." I said, "Of course, I'll come on over." She said, "Actually, it might be a week." I said, "That's cool. I'm not doing anything anyway. I wasn't working at the time." And so she said, "You know what? Let's do your fourth step." I said, "Ooh, we already did that." "Well, let's do it again and make sure you didn't leave anything out." "What?" "Well, come on, let's get out the big book. Let's do this again. Let's talk about this all again." A whole week. You know, I was just so sick and tired of me. You know, but she was really good. She was cute. She said, "You know, you've gotten over some of your anger." I said, "What do you mean by that?" A quiet place in the bright sunshine. These women and the men in the greater Brockton area taught me how to live. They were firm and hard, unrelenting. You know, the cranky ones up in the back room. Looked like they sucked on lemons all day. You know. Don't drink, ask for help, go to meetings, read the book, work your steps. Don't you just want to shoot them? You know, just... And, of course, when I got sober, I was not exactly eloquent or elegant. I had a 2-word response for everyone, for everything, and it was not Merry Christmas. My sponsor used to look at me and say, "Where did you learn that?" I said, I don't know. And then she said, "You know, with someone who has clearly a gift of English language, I think you could find a better way of phrasing that," to which I would say, my 2-word response. So coming full circle to a few weeks ago, from that moment to this, and what I was leaving behind as that plane was coming up over the clouds into the sunshine and the healing warmth of that sun. No, I couldn't feel it in the plane. It was, you know... If I could feel the warmth from the plane, I'm in deep trouble. Okay, I think we went a little too high. Could we bring it down a few thousand feet? 100,000 feet, maybe? Was that as I sat at my boss's desk a few weeks ago and listened to him go up one side and down the other about as mean-spirited spirited as you can imagine. And I used the 10-step restraint of tongue. I suppose at this point it might be helpful to tell you what I do outside of my job. I coordinated a 3-county coalition for domestic violence education and prevention. So you can imagine what a challenge it was for Miss Gandhi here to sit there across from him. Thinking of ways to hurt him. And out of nowhere came those 2 words. And I went, okay, you're in serious trouble now. You know, and I thought, you're going to get fired just on the spot. And I took a deep breath and I was praying and I was dabbling between, is this a compromise? Am I accepting situations I cannot control? Is it because he's not treating me the 7th step, page 76? Is it fear? Of course it was. That's my job on the line. Why am I getting, why? You know, all of that's like racing through, just like snowflakes swirling around outside the window today, just going up. And I watched that whirling dervish and I went, that was my brain a few weeks ago. That's just how it works. And the steps and the concepts and the traditions all come into that. All come into that. Talk about a major principles versus personality issue here. I couldn't hear what he was saying. It was the personality that was in front of me. So I wanted to stop and hear the principle of what he's saying. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the leadership essay in Concept 9. All right? And it talks about your critics. And that maybe, just maybe, there's a little shred of truth to what they're saying. Just a little. I mean, there are those who have nothing better than to a character assassinate. You know, God bless the child. That life should be so dull and boring that you have nothing else to do but take everyone else's inventory. Not that I ever did that. So I went through all of that. You know, the concepts of punitive action. Warranty 5 is about punitive action. Now, I can take punitive action verbally on you, dress you up one side and down the other. You know, Sheila was talking about those looks last night. You have nothing on me. I'm still told that I can drop you dead from across the room, which is pretty funny since I can't see you. Think about that. You know? Everybody's talking about the frostbite they get off their fingers. But I'm listening to this and asking God's guidance. Now, I have been listening to this kind of torrent of nonsense for the better part of 12 months. So has the whole staff. And yes, there's a reason, and it's his fear of financial insecurity, took on too much responsibility, and oh, by the way, he's an untreated adult child of an alcoholic. That I almost wanted to drag over to Dragon Lane, pour a drink down his throat and say, want to come to a meeting? So I understand where he's coming from. That part of my brain is trying to function. The other part of my brain is saying, deck him now. And all of a sudden there was total quiet in my head, sitting at the desk. And when that plane broke the clouds, I recognized that was the place I was at. So I'll bet you all think I got up and walked away. Not on your life. I pushed that chair back, brought out the guns, cocked both barrels, and let go. And I told him he was the meanest and most miserable person to work with for the last 14 months, and I didn't know what he did with his boss, but would he please go find him back, and do not blame the dissolution of a particular program on me. If he had followed my direction, we could have saved it. And those were the facts. Those were not my imagination or my exaggeration. He had mentioned a few statistics to which I pulled out my book. I said, you mean these reports? These reports that are graded superior, 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 and superior? Your initials. And I just let it go. And then I took a deep breath, and I felt so good. Now, 9 out of 10 times I would say to a sponsor, good God, what are you, crazy? And he got very quiet. This is a man who I've worked for 6.5 years. He will never say I'm sorry. He will never admit he's wrong, and I can't change that. I don't like that about him, but I have to accept and embrace that about him. And that, in a nutshell, is what life today is about for me. My spiritual development isn't about being an Alcoholics Anonymous. Alcoholics Anonymous allows me to live in the world. And those principles I must take with me on a daily basis. There's no vacation. I have plenty of women come up and ask me to sponsor them. That lasts usually 1 week. Someone said to me, Marie, you're giving your name out to everybody. I said, they never call. Don't worry about it. I said, when they do, and they go, well, that's a lot of work. I said, you don't have to do what I do unless you want what I have. I'm a guest in this house. I was not a high-bottom drunk. I lost 14-room country estate. I celebrated the loss of a marriage. It was the one thing I started to do when I was still drinking, and the old-timers said, good for you. Don't do anything else. The most difficult step I ever had to take in order to follow God's path was to have faith and trust to leave my children. I was incapable of taking care of myself. I could not compete with that 7-figure income. Let's give them another prize. Let's buy them something else. Oh, you want to go to France? Sure, let's go. And I had enough trust and faith in God that they would be okay. And I took that step. And I need to share with you how difficult it was to talk about that at meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous when I was getting sober, because I saw the judgment in the eyes of others. I saw the discomfort when I would talk about why I thought I drank when I was newly sober. Well, he beats me. And now I fully understand through the process of 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, through the steps and the traditions. The steps teach me how to deal with me. I didn't know how to work with you. But it was in that process of working and loving and fighting and kicking and screaming and then surrendering again and again and again through doing a 4th step and doing that 5th step and finding out it wasn't nearly as scary as anyone thought it was. By the way, in my first 4 years getting sober, I blew by 6 and 7. What are those? They are the cornerstones of your life, Anne-Marie. And I said, well, let's get into the making amends thing, until I saw the word all. And I said, you want me to make amends to a man who would hold my hand in the door and slam it shut several times, fractured my skull 3 times, and permanently damaged my eyes. To which she said, yes. And she was right. You know what my biggest fear was getting sober? That I was going to end up a cold, embittered, angry, miserable woman. And that just about describes my mom. And I did not want to end up like that. And so when they said, "You've got to do it, kid," my sponsor took me to my father's grave to set him free. My dad didn't do anything. I learned a couple of years into sobriety that my father loved me like he loved nothing else in the world. He just couldn't show it. I know we have someone here from Ireland. My dad's family came from Ireland, and he was one of 12 brothers and sisters and a twin. And all of his brothers and sisters had 12 or 14 kids, and all of their kids had 10 and 12. You think they'd get it, you know? And the naming convention was the same: Matthew, Mark, James, Joseph. It's like, it isn't until I went to a family reunion, and it wasn't until I saw the family tree, and then I saw the seating of some 200 members of this family. 50% were over here. They were all sober. The other 50% were over here, half of whom need to get sober. But it isn't until the youngest generation that they actually have reverted back to Celtic names, which is really so refreshing. But my father was a self-admitted alcoholic. My brother was both of my brothers were alcoholic. In fact, one of my brothers died in his sleep, choked to death, drunk. And so in the process of this growth and development, I was terribly afraid that I would be one of these horrible women who just, you just wanted to move away from. And so she took me to my father's grave, and I set him free because he had the audacity to die from a massive coronary at the age of 50 when I was only 20 years old. I saw my dad the day he died. They were moving him out of intensive care back to the general population because he was doing well. And I went in to see him and sat with him, and we talked for a long time. That I was finally going to get my driver's license. You didn't need one in Boston. Now I was living out in the country, you kind of needed one. And I talked to him about my daughter, who was about a year and a half old at that time. And I was rattling, and finally he just stopped me, and he took my hand, and he said, "Annie, there's only one thing I want for you. I want just once to look in those eyes and know that you're really happy. Your eyes are the mirror of your soul." And it was the night before that I had experienced that beating that I told you about and had my first drink. And he knew. He knew there was something terribly, terribly wrong. And I couldn't talk to him. And I left, and I took the train back home, and I was getting on the train, and just before I stepped in the door, I stepped back. Something about the clergy. There were these three priests behind me. And I stopped and I started crying. They said, "Young lady, can we help you? What's the matter?" And I said, "I just was visiting my dad at the hospital." And I said, I didn't say I loved him. I need to go back. And they said, "No, don't worry about it. You can talk to him tomorrow. He's probably tired." He died that night. And so I took that for the next 15, 16 years and used it as a weapon. How dare you abandon me? And that was one of the underlying issues of my alcoholism. And that all comes for that swirling snow. So where's the river in all of this? Because I was willing to do what people told me to do, I went to my brother's grave also, and I set him free. I know today that my brother was mentally disturbed. I know that he didn't know better, that he was a sick person. And I just set him free. And I am really freed from that. And I wrote a letter to my former husband. And I knew the harm I had done. I knew the harm I had done. I hit him in the only place that meant anything to him, and that was his pocketbook, his bank account. Oh, let's add another zero to that. Yes, that's a withdrawal. Thank you very much. And the bills would come in, and I'd go into the trash until I realized that the people who would pay the highest price for that would experience the greatest consequences would be my two children. And you can't undo something when you've started that, for sure. So I wrote about that, and I said to my sponsor, well, what do I do with this now? She said, you give it to me. I said, that's it? She said, Annie, it says that we make amends, but we don't do it if it's going to harm someone else or ourselves. If you go within 10 feet of him, he'll kill you. You can't do that. The point was, I needed to know you were willing to take these steps as they are written, not as you decide you want to do them. And that is the whole point of being a guest in AA's house. I would no sooner walk into your home and decide to rearrange your furniture, change how you do your cooking, tell you how to train your pet, or raise your kids. Nor do I have the right, and it would be spiritually arrogant for me, to decide to change AA's house. So I did what I was taught. I learned about AA's history. And if you haven't dabbled into AA's history, please do it. Because if we don't know the history of what came before us, of what the struggles were, why we have those 12 traditions, then we are destined to repeat them. Like go on parades and say, recovery needs a face. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. The concepts and the warranties are very clear. We don't defend AA. We don't clarify misinformation out there. And we have no opinion on outside issues, Hollywood related or not. Bill Wilson wrote that AA's unity would not preserve itself, that every individual in this fellowship must take responsibility for it. Those traditions are not for groups, they're for me. So how do I use those traditions in my life? Well, the first thing, and I was talking earlier about this, to the women that I sponsor who are married or have a significant other, I remind them that they are not autonomous. That what they do, the decisions they make, the action they take, impacts someone else. And in some cases, many someone else's. Someone else, who cares? That we need to consult. Concept 3 gives us a right of decision. Only after we have carefully consulted those who will be impacted by this decision. And then if we do make a decision without that, we must report how we've done it. So to walk in the house and say, hi honey, bought a Maserati, quit my job, shaved my head. And what do you think about that? Several years ago, I had a sponsee call me and she said, oh, Annie, you're going to be so excited. And I said, try me. She said, remember how I told you I always wanted that big truck? Yes. I said, the one that's $50,000? She said, yep. I said, is it silver? Yes. I said, what else did we do today? She said, I pierced my nose and a few other things. I said, I'll skip the details, but that's really going to look good at the teller's point in the bank. I said, anything else I should know about? I've got a mohawk. Always wanted one. I said, they're out of style. You know, right down the middle of it. I said, I suppose. I said, did you go goth? She said, no, but I was thinking of it. I said, do you remember that part about sponsorship not being report of actions taken? Sponsors are a sounding board. She said, well, so what do you think? I said, there's nothing to say. You don't want to hear what I really think. Are you mad? Why do they say that? You know? Are you mad at me? Okay, let's talk about the steps again. Unreasonable expectations and demands on others. Expectation breeds disappointment. If I'm angry, then I put an expectation of control on you. No, I'm not mad. Don't drink, ask for help, go to meetings, work the steps, find a newcomer, and God help you with that head. Wear a hat. Find a way to decorate it, because I don't think the bank's going to be too happy. And that has been the story of my life. The river. Now, you all who live here in Detroit, I guess you're kind of used to it. And I used to live in Boston, so I'm very accustomed to being near an ocean. And even where I lived in central Massachusetts, we had 5 lakes and 5 state parks. So it was, there was always that openness. But I was watching the river. Every morning since I've been out here in Detroit, I've opened up the window. Well, not the window. Yeah. Now, wouldn't that be exciting? So why are we down here over, at the GM Center? Well, I don't know. Some woman opened up the window to pray and meditate, and just... Now she's hanging by her nails. I opened up the drapes, and the first couple of mornings I was here was bright and sunshiny, and I could just stand and feel that sun on me while I prayed and while I meditated. And then I stood, and then I curled up on the chair, and I watched the river. And I've been instinctively taught, to travel the river. That's what Alcoholics Anonymous is about. Understanding about being powerless and the insanity of my behavior, knowing there is a God, it is not me, and the God of my childhood, punitive, fire and brimstone, does not exist. The God of my understanding is warm and gentle and, above all, totally forgiving. There will be peace and serenity in my life to the degree that I bring it to yours. So I cannot live on the 3 R's of anger: revenge, resentment, retaliation. Can't do it. That will kill me if I want to behave that way. And if I'm going to jump in the sandbox, at 60 years of age, jumping in a sandbox like a 10-year-old looks pretty silly. And that's emotionally the picture I get in my head. The 2 pigtails coming out this way down long, the old saddle shoes, just, well, I'm going home. That's like the sponsee saying, are you mad? What are you, 10? So you got to travel the river. And as I looked out at that river from my room, there is the story of living the incredible tapestry, of weaving the steps, the traditions, and the concept with their warranties into my daily life. Under no circumstance can I stay sober and take punitive action on you, including in here. Step 4 says we drop the word blame from our thought and word. One of Bill Wilson's favorite books was Sermon on the Mount. Take a look at it sometime. First, to see how he plagiarized. He never made a secret of that. Why should I write it? Emmett Fox did it way better than me. Those are the 12 steps. But I was brought up by a group of old-timers, those old-timers in Brockton, who said, as you think, so shall you live. And they were firm believers in what goes around, comes around. So you ready for this? I'm standing here making amends to this entire conference. And you're wondering why. In 1992, I had the privilege of chairing what had been a 2-year process of bringing together our Northeast Regional AA Service Assembly, NARASA. We modeled it on PRASA for those in the Pacific region. Thank you very much, because I spent 3 years out your neck of the woods going to PRASA for 3 years to be able to bring it back to the East. And the first year we held it, we held it on Valentine's Day weekend. And then when the business meeting of the event came together, and said, what about the last weekend in February? And I said, well, okay, that's cool. I said, if you don't want this weekend. And they said, well, no, because you see, it interferes with this conference that we go to sometimes. I said, what conference is that? And they said something about International AA Women's Conference. I don't recall what I said at the time. It wasn't 2 words. But I think I had some smart aleck remark to pass. So I stand in front of you making amends. And my amends was to come here on Josephine's invitation to share my experience, strength, and hope. And I didn't think about that until I was watching the snow swirling today. And went, International AA Women's Conference. Oh my God. Well, there's no one here who would remember what I said anyway, right? Because you weren't there. I've moved to some different things, and I know I shared with you that I had to step away from my children to get sober. If you don't believe in miracles, let me share what happened to me. How many of you are under 5 years sober? Okay. I was 11 months sober, getting sober. I don't call that sober. I was 11 months, I used to call it sober. I was just so, right. 5 years. Listen when you hear them say 5 years. Going on 11 months sober, I was having some problems and I didn't know quite what was going on. And so what had happened when I did get sober is they did all these scans on me, and that's when they discovered that I had 3 untreated skull fractures, and that all my bones have been broken, and my face looks like a jigsaw puzzle, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And they said, someday this is going to start to bother you. You think? It's called pain. Oh, we can give you something for that. No, you can't. At about a year and a half, so at about 11 months sober, the doctors in Boston at Mass General said, you can never again get behind the wheel of a car. And that didn't particularly bother me because I owed an excise tax, so I really wasn't too worried about it at that point. But the enormity of that did not hit me. I have not been behind the wheel of a car for more than 24 years. About 6 months after that, so I'm about a year and a half sober, they said, okay, your body's healing. We're starting to see more of what's going on, and you're going to lose your eyesight. And I said, okay, day at a time. Because an old-timer had said to me, Annie, what's the worst possible thing that can happen to you, and are you drinking about that today? And I said, the worst possible thing that can happen is to never see my children again, and that is a fact. That's what I was threatened with, and that's what happened. By the way, they were told I had abandoned them. And the family supported him in not giving them any of the cards, letters, gifts, or phone messages that I left. I found that out when I was 3 years sober, and I literally ripped a phone off a pole. I don't have that kind of strength. More importantly, remember me, A plus good doobie, the first thought that went through my mind is that, God, that's a federal offense. And I just took off. Told my sponsor what had happened, and she said, don't you have a meeting to be at tonight? I said, yes, I'm supposed to chair a gratitude meeting. She said, that's where you're going to be. So I was about 18 months sober when the guys at MGH sat around me and they said, okay, we need to sit down and talk to you about this. The scar tissue from the untreated skull fractures has created an aneurysm in your brain, and we can't get at it with traditional invasive surgery. You are terminal, inoperable, and untreatable. And you will probably hemorrhage several times before you die. And I understood what they said, before we hope you die. And I was put in a death and dying group. It was one of the first prototypes at the time. And I found out that people were not so much afraid of dying as they hadn't lived. And at that point, early in sobriety, I knew I had lived. I knew I had made a difference because of Alcoholics Anonymous and God, and I knew there would always be hope. And that old-timer who adopted me as her grandchild said, you never say you're dying. You never say you're losing your eyesight. The doctors say that. Don't you own it? I was 3 years sober when I had my first little version of Star Wars. And when they went in to shrink the aneurysm and freeze it, it was almost gone. They said, we have no explanation for that. I said, hell, I do. That left me with a vision of the length of my arm. But it was better than none. Because a few months before that, I had opened my eyes and I knew the sun was on my face because I could feel the warmth, but I couldn't see. So for 6 months, I was without eyesight in Alcoholics Anonymous. Amazing grace. Was blind, but now I see. The 36 spiritual principles of Alcoholics Anonymous weave like a tapestry through my life. It is a never-ending challenge and journey. I was 18 years sober. Came home on a Monday afternoon, and my phone was blinking like all those little things from Portland. Which meant the sponsees were calling. In having a momentary spiritual relapse, I said, I am really tired. And then there comes the voice. 11-step prayer says, shut up. Do I ever get to just not be the good doobie? And I couldn't. I had to go over and listen to the machine. Yeah. And the first one, it was, get over it. Okay. Look, I took her to dinner. All right? I made amends. And the second one, I can't remember. And the third, and then I hit the fourth, and it was, hi, this is your son, Gary. And here's my phone number. Give me a call. I had to play it like 20 times. It was a voice I didn't recognize. When I last saw him, he was 11 years old. I had no idea what he looked like. I had no idea what he had done. So I called my sponsor. My sponsor's from Texas, by the way. I have a long-distance sponsor, and Patty R. Got sober in Houston, lives now in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And I called her, and even, she's out in some island out off the coast of Texas. Like, what? So I called her daughter, and she said, oh, Mom's around somewhere. I'll find her. And she finally got back to me, and she said, why haven't you called? And I said, fear? Fear. She said, well, you need to call him, and then we're going to need to talk about you and God. Because I would have gone to my grave telling you that I had a faith that was unshakable in the power of God in my life. I was blind and I could see. I was told I would never walk again, and I don't wear stilettos anymore. I used to. I was a prize when I showed up. The hair, the stilettos, and they watch it, Prince, across the floor. And so I called, and we spent about almost 2 hours, a little more than 2 hours on the phone. And I came away with the sense of, that is the most balanced young man I have ever heard in my life. At the age of 18, while I was serving Eastern Massachusetts as the delegate to Eastern Massachusetts to the General Service Conference of Alcoholics Anonymous, my son was walking the street homeless in the rain and facing a life sentence. And a very wise judge said, I will put you in this 1-year residential program, and if you clean up your act, we will take the sentence off. One mistake, and you are history. And some people in another 12-step program wrapped their arms around him, and they guided him into a way of life that absolutely blows me away. And that October, he said, I would like you to come to my home group. I'm celebrating my 13th anniversary. I spent Thanksgiving with my son and daughter-in-law in their home. He came with a package deal. And that was okay. The first thing she said to me after 10 minutes of conversation, she said, you are the sanest adult in the whole pack. All right. Okay. A year later, we've been reconciled for 4 years. I went to family counseling and therapy with him, and I answered every question that was asked. The grace of God, he does not remember the violence. He does not remember seeing me like that. And I know that is the grace of God. And all through the therapy sessions, I sat and cried. And his therapist said, "So, what do you think about that?" By the way, I spent 6 years behind the desk saying, "So how do you really feel about that?" It's another story. I almost killed my therapist. She had the audacity to ask me about my children while I was locked up in that psych unit. I said, "Look, you little twit." Up against the wall she went. Her feet dangling. She was like, she was one of those little preppy things, Please. And instead of filing charges, she said, "Welcome back to the real world." She said, "You can go home now." Anyway, I'm sitting there, and my son turned and looked at me, and he said, "I've spent all these years of my life thinking of parents as unemotional or out of control. I never equated genuine human warmth and feeling with a parent." 2 years it took, and just as naturally as he says hi, he said, "Good night, Mom, I love you." Because of Alcoholics Anonymous and the grace of God in my life, you have brought me from the darkness of blindness to be able to see. You brought me to a point that I can appreciate your river out there and know that it's quiet on the top and there's a deep undercurrent there. And I need to travel that river. I don't control what happens and where it goes. My job is to show up and do the next right thing and to treat every one of God's children with gentleness, courtesy, kindness, and love, no matter what. Remember, can't even think it. Can't even think it. And that's the incredible tapestry. And when I get on my knees tonight, it will be with tears of gratitude that I had another day, that you all welcomed me, and that we shared the language of the heart. Thank you for my life.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Sobercast is ad-free, and we'd like your help in order to keep it that way. So if you'd like to help us be self-supporting by pledging $1 or $2 a month, visit Sobercast.com and look for the donate links. Thank you very much.